Is this supposed to be some kind of joke? The voice of Lieutenant Cade sliced through the humid, gunpowder-scented air of the kill house, each word a shard of ice. He stood, a monument to youthful perfection and institutional power, his arms crossed over a chest sculpted by a regimen of relentless physical exertion. His gaze was fixed not on the team of SEAL candidates who had just failed a room-clearing drill, but on the stooped figure of the old man shuffling in the far corridor. The man, Samuel, moved with the unhurried, almost glacial pace of the profoundly elderly, his broom making a soft, rhythmic shushing sound against the concrete floor as he swept up a small galaxy of spent brass casings. To the lieutenant, this slow, methodical progress was an act of defiance, a personal affront to the high-tempo, lethal precision he demanded in his domain. Samuel was a ghost in the machine of war, a relic of a bygone era whose very presence seemed to dull the razor's edge of the present. Cade, a man who measured the world in seconds and millimeters, saw in the janitor's patient movements a profound and irritating inefficiency. He used the old man's presence as a rhetorical weapon against his trainees, who stood breathing heavily, their high-tech weaponry feeling suddenly leaden in their hands. "Look at him, gentlemen," Cade sneered, his voice dripping with a carefully cultivated contempt. 80 years old, moving at the speed of continental drift. He has one simple job, and he performs it with all the urgency of a melting glacier. And you wonder why you failed this evolution? Because you have been contaminated by his slowness. Indecision is slow. Weakness is slow. Age is slow. Here, we are none of those things. He turned his full attention to Samuel, striding toward him with the predatory confidence of a wolf closing in on a lamb. The trainees exchanged uneasy glances. This was part of the lieutenant's well-known psychological curriculum, the art of using humiliation as a tool for motivation. But today it felt excessively cruel, misplaced. Samuel, seemingly oblivious, continued his work, his focus entirely on the task at hand. This infuriating lack of reaction, this refusal to be intimidated, was what truly ignited Cade's fury. The lieutenant craved acknowledgement of his power, and the old man's quiet dignity was a silent, maddening denial of that power. He felt an irrational anger build within him, the kind of frustration a perfectionist feels when confronted with a flaw he cannot immediately correct. He saw the old man not as a person, but as a symbol of decay, a living embodiment of the entropy he waged a daily war against. The silence, the patience, the humility, it was all a form of passive resistance, and Cade was determined to shatter it, to force a response, to see a flicker of fear in those calm, ancient eyes. He would make the old man an object lesson in the brutal truth of the world as he saw it. The old and the slow are obstacles to be removed or broken. Lieutenant Cade's eyes, sharp and analytical, roved over Samuel's frail form, searching for a specific point of failure, a tangible symbol of the weakness he found so offensive. He dismissed the stooped shoulders and the shuffle in the old man's walk as too obvious. Instead, his gaze fixated on Samuel's hands as they gripped the simple wooden handle of the broom. They were the hands of a man who had lived a long, hard life. The knuckles were swollen, gnarled like the roots of an old oak tree, and the skin was a thin, translucent tapestry of liver spots, wrinkles, and faded white scars. To Cade, they were the hands of a grandfather, fit for nothing more strenuous than holding a teacup or turning the pages of a newspaper. He saw arthritis, weakness, the inevitable and pathetic decay of the human machine. A cruel smirk twisted his lips as the perfect vector for his lesson presented itself. He would use those hands to make his point. "Look at those hands, gentlemen," he announced, his voice ringing with mock pity. He reached out and, without permission, grabbed Samuel's wrist, lifting the old man's hand into the air for all to see. Samuel offered no resistance, his arm pliant in the lieutenant's strong grip, his eyes remaining placid. These are the hands of the past. Gnarled, weak, trembling. He gave Samuel's hand a slight shake to emphasize his point, though it hadn't been trembling at all. These hands could not field strip a weapon. They could not apply a tourniquet under fire. They could not hold a steady sight picture. They are useless artifacts. They are a liability. The trainees remained silent, their discomfort now mingled with a growing sense of shame. They were warriors, taught to respect their elders. Yet they were compelled by the chain of command to stand by and witness this degrading spectacle. Cade, fueled by their silent attention, felt a surge of righteous power. He was not just an instructor. He was a high priest of modernity, purging the temple of the old and the obsolete. To finalize his demonstration, to create a moment of unforgettable theater, he unslung his own rifle. It was the apex predator of firearms, a heavily modified Heckler & Koch 416, bristling with an expensive optic, a laser designator, and a polished suppressor. It was a perfectly tuned instrument of death, representing the bleeding edge of military technology. With a dramatic, almost ceremonial movement, he shoved the rifle into Samuel's chest, forcing the old man to take it. "Here, Grandpa," Cade sneered, his voice dripping with condescending poison. "Hold a real tool for once in your life. Try to wrap those arthritic claws around it. Let's see if you can even bear its weight without collapsing." He expected a fumble, a clumsy, awkward struggle as the old, weak hands failed to find a proper grip on the alien architecture of the modern weapon. He envisioned the rifle clattering onto the concrete, a final, emphatic testament to the old man's utter irrelevance. But the moment Samuel's gnarled fingers made contact with the cold aluminum of the rifle, the narrative Cade was so carefully constructing began to unravel with breathtaking speed. The instant the textured pistol grip and the machined handguard of the rifle settled into his palms, the world of the sterile, brightly lit kill house dissolved into a maelstrom of green, brown, and blood red. The controlled, air-conditioned environment was violently supplanted by the suffocating, wet blanket humidity of the Mekong Delta in 1968. The sharp, clean scent of solvent and brass was washed away by the primordial stench of mangrove swamp, stagnant water, and the coppery tang of fear. He was no longer Samuel, the janitor. He was Petty Officer Jones, a Navy SEAL attached to a MACVSOG reconnaissance team, and he was deep in a world of hurt. His reality was the sucking mud of a canal bank, the deafening chatter of an enemy machine gun nest that had his team pinned down, and the screams of a young Marine whose leg had been torn apart by the fusillade. The M60, the pig, their lifeline, their god of fire, had fallen silent. The gunner, a giant of a man from Ohio, lay beside it, his eyes wide and unseeing, a neat, dark hole in his helmet. The gun was jammed. A catastrophic feed failure. In the sudden, terrifying lull in their own covering fire, the enemy's confidence surged, and the volume of incoming rounds intensified, chewing up the mud around them, thudding into the body of the dead gunner. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm them. Without the pig, they were ghosts about to be exorcised. But then his hands went to work. They were not the gnarled, slow hands of an old man. They were the hands of a 25-year-old operator at the peak of his lethal craft, covered in slick, red mud and the blood of the wounded Marine he'd just dragged to cover. His fingers moved with a furious, preternatural grace. There was no thought, only a deep, kinetic intelligence, a conversation between man and machine that transcended conscious language. His left hand braced the weapon while his right thumb flew to the cover latch, flipping it open. His fingers, feeling rather than seeing, dove into the intricate guts of the feed tray. They diagnosed the problem in a microsecond, a double-fed round, brass casing deformed and wedged against the bolt. It was a nasty, complex jam that would normally require tools and time, neither of which they had. But his hands knew the secret language of the weapon. His forefinger found the exact pressure point on the side of the mangled casing. His thumb hooked under the belt of remaining ammunition, lifting it with surgical precision to relieve the pressure. With a deft, violent twist of his index and middle fingers, he ripped the jammed round free, tossing it aside without a glance. He slammed the cover down, yanked the charging handle to the rear, and let it fly home with a satisfying, metallic clack. The entire process had taken less than 4 seconds. He shoved the dead gunner aside, settled his own body behind the massive weapon, and sighted down the barrel. He squeezed the trigger, and the pig roared back to life, spitting a torrent of 7.62 millimeters death across the canal, tearing into the tree-line, silencing the enemy gun, and giving his team the breathing room they needed to break contact and save themselves. His hands, caked in mud and gore, had been the instruments of their salvation. They were not weak. They were history. They were skill. They were survival. Back in the present, the echoes of that long-ago battle faded, leaving behind a silence in the range that was deeper and more profound than before. A mere 2 seconds had passed in objective time, but within Samuel, a lifetime of sleeping violence had been reawakened. The change in him was seismic, yet almost invisible to the untrained eye. His hands, the very objects of Lieutenant Cade's derision, had closed around the 416 Hong Kong dollars with an unnatural familiarity. They were not the fumbling, uncertain hands of an old man, but the confident, expert hands of a master. His right hand enveloped the pistol grip, his index finger lying perfectly straight along the frame, high above the trigger guard, a classic sign of immaculate trigger discipline. His left hand found a precise balance point on the handguard, his thumb pointed forward in a modern C-clamp grip that Cade himself taught to his trainees, a grip that seemed utterly incongruous with the man's apparent age. His stooped shoulders squared, his center of gravity lowered, and his feet shifted, without conscious thought, into a perfectly balanced, aggressive fighting stance. The advanced weapon no longer looked like a prop in a cruel joke. It looked like it belonged in his hands, an extension of his very being. Cade, still wrapped in the cocoon of his own arrogance, saw nothing. He saw only the old man holding his rifle, and he was preparing to mock him for the way he held it. But from his vantage point in the glass-walled control booth, Gary, a civilian contractor tasked with maintaining the range's sophisticated electronic systems, saw everything. Gary was a retired Marine gunnery sergeant, a man who had spent 20 years as an armorer. He knew weapons not just as a user, but as a craftsman. He understood their mechanics, their balance, their souls. He had been watching Cade's performance with a slow-burning rage, a contempt for the young officer's disrespect that was a violation of the codes Gary held sacred. When Cade forced the rifle on the old janitor, Gary had leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. And he saw the transformation. He saw the grip. He saw the stance. He saw the way the old man's eyes, for a split second, looked down the length of the rifle not with confusion, but with an unnerving, predatory focus. It was the look of a man not holding a tool, but greeting an old friend. Gary's blood ran cold. This was no ordinary janitor. This was a shooter. No, it was more than that. The economy of motion, the absolute certainty in the hands. This was a professional, a man for whom the gun was as natural as breathing. The injustice of the situation became a physical weight in Gary's chest. He knew he had to do something. Cade's authority here was absolute, and a direct confrontation would be useless. He needed a bigger gun, metaphorically speaking. He remembered the notice he'd seen that morning. A 4-star Marine general was on base for a joint command briefing. It was a long shot, a wild breach of protocol, but Gary was a man who trusted his gut, and his gut was screaming at him that a great wrong was being committed. He pulled out his personal cell phone. He had a friend, a master sergeant who worked as an aide at the base command headquarters. He dialed the number, his heart pounding. "Mac, it's Gary over at the range. Listen, I need you to do something for me, and you can't ask any questions. You need to get a message to General Patton's aide. Right now? Tell him the general needs to get to range 7 immediately. Tell him a living piece of history is being dishonored by a Navy lieutenant. Tell him it's about a man named Samuel Jones." While inside the insulated confines of range 7, Lieutenant Cade remained blissfully ignorant of the forces he had set in motion. The serene operational tempo of Naval Base Coronado was being thrown into chaos. A single, urgent message, passed from a retired Marine gunny to a master sergeant aide, had found its way to the ear of a Marine colonel, who, after a moment of stunned disbelief, had strode into a high-level briefing and whispered into the ear of his commanding officer. Moments later, the briefing was unceremoniously adjourned. The base, a meticulously ordered universe of naval tradition, was about to be invaded by the United States Marine Corps. The first sign was the sudden appearance of 4 black, armored Suburbans, the kind reserved for general officers, screaming away from the headquarters building. Emblazoned on their doors was not the Navy's anchor, but the eagle, globe, and anchor of the Marines. At the front and back of this impromptu motorcade were base security vehicles, their lights flashing, struggling to keep pace and clear a path for a 4-star general who was moving with the speed and purpose of a man responding to a national crisis. Sailors and officers going about their daily routines stopped and stared, their mouths agape. A Marine general's motorcade, moving at combat speed, was unheard of. It was a disruption of the natural order, a breach of inter-service etiquette that suggested something of monumental importance was underway. The motorcade didn't slow as it approached the SEAL training complex. It roared through a security checkpoint, scattering guards, and screeched to a halt in a perfect tactical formation in front of the building housing Range 7. Doors flew open and a full detail of Marine officers in crisp service uniforms emerged, their faces grim, their movements precise. They formed a security perimeter, their presence an intimidating and unambiguous statement. The base commander, a Navy captain, was seen sprinting from a nearby building, his face a perfect picture of panic and confusion, shouting questions that were completely ignored by the stone-faced Marines. The rear door of the command vehicle opened. General Thomas Stonewall Patton, the assistant commandant of the Marine Corps, emerged. He was a man who seemed to have been carved from granite and fury. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a chest full of medals that told the story of America's wars for the last 30 years, he was the living embodiment of the Corps' fighting spirit. His eyes, the color of cold steel, scanned the building, and he began to stride toward the entrance, his aides and security detail moving with him like a human battering ram. Inside, Kate had finally noticed the distant sirens but had dismissed them as part of a base-wide drill. He had turned his attention back to Samuel. "So, what do you think of that, old-timer?" he was saying, gesturing to the rifle in Samuel's hands. "A little more complicated than your broom, eh? I'll bet you can't even find the—" His words were cut off as the doors to the range were flung open with a deafening crash. General Patton stood there, framed in the doorway, a figure of incandescent rage. The world had just tilted on its axis, and Lieutenant Cade, standing at the epicenter, was about to be ground into dust. The thunderous sound of the doors slamming open was a physical shockwave that ripped through the room. Instinct and training took over. The SEAL candidates, seeing the 4 stars glittering on the general's collar, instantly snapped to the most rigid posture of attention they had ever held in their lives. Lieutenant Cade, his face a canvas of disbelief and dawning horror, spun around and tried to bark out the command to call the room to attention, but the sound caught in his throat like dust. General Patton paid him no mind. He strode into the room, his presence so immense and powerful that it seemed to suck the very air out of the space. His steel-gray eyes swept the scene, taking in the ramrod-straight trainees, the terrified lieutenant, and finally, they locked onto the old, stooped janitor holding the rifle. The transformation in the general's demeanor was instantaneous and staggering. The mask of cold fury dissolved, replaced by a look of profound, almost disbelieving reverence. The hard lines of his face softened, and his eyes, which had been chips of ice moments before, seemed to mist over with an emotion that was part awe and part sorrow. He completely ignored Lieutenant Cade, walking past him as if he were a piece of furniture. He marched directly toward Samuel, his polished shoes echoing like hammer blows in the cavernous silence. He halted 3 feet away, his body held at a perfect military brace. Then, in a gesture that defied every protocol of rank and service, General Thomas Patton, the second highest-ranking officer in the entire United States Marine Corps, rendered the slowest, most deliberate, and most respectful salute of his life. His voice, when he spoke, was a powerful baritone that boomed through the room, a voice accustomed to commanding armies, now filled with a deep and humbling deference. "Master Chief Jones," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It is a profound and unexpected honor, sir." The title, Master Chief Petty Officer, sent a fresh wave of shock through the room. Cade's mind struggled to process the information. The janitor? A Master Chief? The highest enlisted rank in the Navy? It was impossible. The general lowered his salute but remained at attention. He turned his head slightly, addressing the room but never taking his eyes off Samuel. "For those of you too young to know your own history," he began, his voice taking on a formal, declamatory tone, "you are in the presence of greatness. This is Master Chief Petty Officer Samuel the Ghost Jones. He is not just a Navy SEAL. He is one of the originals, a plank owner, a man who wrote the book that you now study." He paused, letting the weight of that statement settle. In the spring of 1968, during the Tet Offensive, I was a young second lieutenant in the Marine Corps. My platoon was cut off, surrounded, and about to be annihilated near a worthless canal in the middle of nowhere. Our machine guns were jammed, our radio man was dead, and we were out of miracles. The general's eyes seemed to look past the walls of the range into a distant, bloody memory. And then, out of the jungle, came the ghosts. A SOG team, led by this man. They didn't save us with overwhelming firepower. They saved us with expertise. I watched this man, under a hail of fire that was cutting down my Marines like wheat, crawl to a jammed M60, clear a catastrophic malfunction in less time than it takes to draw a breath, and then use that very gun to turn the tide of the entire engagement. He finally turned his gaze directly on Samuel. "You saved my life that day, Master Chief. You saved the lives of my entire platoon. I never got to thank you. You and your men vanished back into the jungle as quickly as you had appeared. To find you here, like this," the general's voice trailed off, his emotions momentarily overwhelming him. Having established Samuel's legendary status, placing him firmly in the pantheon of military heroes, General Patton turned his attention to Lieutenant Cade. The shift was like a weather front moving in, the temperature in the room dropping 20 degrees as the warmth and reverence in the general's face were replaced by a glacial, four-star fury. His eyes narrowed to dangerous slits, and he took a single, menacing step toward the young officer. His voice, which had been booming and emotional, now dropped to a low, lethal whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. "Lieutenant," he began, the title itself an insult, spoken with the same contempt one might use for an insect. "I have seen many things in my career. I have seen acts of unbelievable bravery, and I have seen moments of profound stupidity. But never, in all my years, have I witnessed such a pathetic, arrogant, and ignorant abuse of authority." Cade was visibly trembling now, his face slick with a cold sweat. He looked like a man awaiting his own execution. The general gestured with a dismissive wave at the pristine, high-tech range around them. "You stand here, in this multi-million-dollar facility, a palace built on the lessons learned by men like him. You teach from manuals filled with tactics that were written in his blood and the blood of his comrades. And you have the unmitigated gall to stand before him and lecture him on weakness." The general's voice grew colder, more precise with every word, a surgeon dissecting Cade's soul. "You mocked his hands. His hands. Lieutenant, those hands have forgotten more about combat than you will ever learn. Those hands have saved lives, taken lives, and repaired the very weapons of war, while lesser men were cowering in the mud. The gnarled knuckles you found so pathetic were earned in places you don't have the clearance to read about. Those hands are a testament to a life of service and sacrifice that you, in your pampered, simulated world, cannot possibly comprehend." He pointed a rigid finger at Cade's chest. "You are a product of an institution that he helped to build. You hold your rank because he and men like him held the line. He is a living monument to the very ideals you pretend to represent, and you treated him like garbage. You are not an instructor. You are a blasphemer standing in a holy place, with no idea of the meaning of the ground on which you stand. You are a profound disappointment, not only to the Navy, but to any man who has ever worn the uniform of this country." The general's final words were delivered with a quiet finality that was more crushing than any punishment. "You are not fit to carry his cleaning supplies." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of Cade's ragged, shallow breathing. His world, his career, his very sense of self had been publicly and comprehensively annihilated. In the wake of the general's verbal demolition, the room was suspended in a state of suffocating tension. Lieutenant Cade stood as a statue of shame, his arrogance stripped away, leaving only the raw, trembling core of a man utterly broken. General Patton's fury still radiated from him, a promise of swift and severe official consequences to follow. It was in this charged, volatile silence that Samuel moved. He gently placed the advanced rifle on a nearby bench, his movements slow and deliberate, imbued with a quiet reverence. He then took a step forward, positioning himself between the enraged general and the humiliated lieutenant. He turned first to the general, his eyes clear and calm, holding a wisdom that seemed as old as the mountains. His voice, when he spoke, was a soft, gravelly murmur, yet it commanded the absolute attention of everyone in the room. "General," he said, his tone respectful but firm. "You honor me with your memory, and I thank you for it." But the boy, he did not know. The use of the word boy was not condescending. It was diagnostic. It defined the root of the problem not as malice, but as ignorance. He is a product of the peace we fought for. He was forged in classrooms and simulators. His pride is a new shield, untested by real fire. It is shiny, but it is thin. A shield like that can make a man think he's invincible, and it can blind him to the history of the warriors who came before him. Samuel then turned his gaze to Cade. He did not see a disgraced officer. He saw a student in the midst of a brutal, but necessary, lesson. There was no anger in his eyes, only a deep, profound pity. "Leadership is a heavy burden, son," he said, his voice gentle. "Heavier than any rifle. Sometimes, the weight makes you stumble. The important thing is not that you fell. It's that you learn how to get up. You have to learn that the men you lead are not tools for your own glory. They are a sacred trust. And respect, it must flow both ways. Up the chain and down it. That is what holds the line when everything else breaks." He looked back at General Patton, whose face had softened as he listened to the old warrior's words. He has learned a lesson today that this facility could never teach him. It's a lesson that will hurt. Let that be enough. He is one of ours, General, a young warrior of a new generation. He needs guidance. He doesn't need to be destroyed. The quiet power of Samuel's plea for grace was more stunning than the general's rage. It was the final, irrefutable evidence of his greatness, not his past heroism in the face of the enemy, but his present compassion in the face of a foolish boy's mistake. It was the ultimate lesson in strength, delivered by the humblest of men. General Patton stared at Samuel for a long, silent moment, the conflict of his own righteous anger warring with the profound wisdom of the old Master Chief's words. Finally, a slow, deep sigh escaped his lips, and he gave a single, decisive nod. The rage had passed, replaced by a grudging, deep respect for Samuel's act of clemency. He understood that true justice, in this case, was not about punishment, but about education and redemption. "You are a better man than I am, Master Chief," the general said, his voice low and sincere. He then turned to the base captain, who had materialized by the door and was trying to make himself as small as possible. "Captain," the general commanded, his tone all business now. "Lieutenant Cade's future is in your hands. I trust you will ensure that his educational development continues in a manner appropriate to the severity of his ignorance. I expect a full report on my desk." The captain, looking immensely relieved, saluted sharply. "Yes, General. It will be my top priority." The general then turned back to Samuel, a warm, genuine smile spreading across his face for the first time. "Master Chief Jones, the offer I was about to make you for lunch is hereby rescinded. You will be joining me as my guest of honor at my personal table for the duration of my visit. There is a generation of young Marines and sailors who need to hear what you have to say. And frankly, so do I." Samuel offered a small, humble nod of acceptance. "It would be my privilege, General." With that, General Patton gestured to his Marine aides, who moved to form an impromptu honor guard around the old janitor. As Samuel was escorted from the range, flanked by a 4-star general and 2 colonels, the SEAL candidates watched in absolute, stunned silence. The world they knew, with its clear hierarchies and definitions of strength, had been turned completely upside down. They had witnessed a janitor be saluted by a general. They had seen arrogance crushed by history. And they had learned a lesson about the nature of honor that would resonate with them for the rest of their lives. Lieutenant Cade remained behind, alone in the center of the room. The trainees studiously avoided his gaze. The silence was his true punishment, a suffocating blanket of their collective judgment. The weight of his actions, the weight of the history he had so casually insulted, finally settled upon him, a burden far heavier than any rifle he had ever lifted. He had wanted to teach a lesson about strength, and in the end, he had become the most powerful lesson of all, a living demonstration of weakness, ignorance, and the long, hard road to redemption. A month passed. The incident in Range 7 had become a quiet, potent legend on the base, a modern parable whispered among trainees and instructors alike. Lieutenant Cade had been reassigned, taken off instructional duty and buried in a logistics office, a purgatory of paperwork and quiet contemplation. He had changed. The sharp, arrogant edge was gone, sanded away by the abrasive reality of his humiliation. He was quieter, more thoughtful, his eyes holding a new depth, a shadow of the lesson he had learned. One evening, long after the last shots had been fired and the trainees had gone, Samuel was making his slow, methodical rounds in the now empty and silent Range 7. The only sound was the familiar, soft shushing of his broom. He looked up to see a figure standing in the doorway. It was Cade, not in uniform, but in simple civilian clothes. He looked hesitant, uncertain, a stark contrast to the man who had commanded this space with such absolute authority just a few weeks prior. Cade walked slowly into the center of the room, stopping at the exact spot where he had been dismantled by General Patton. He did not offer a rehearsed apology or an excuse. He simply stood before the old man, his hands empty, his posture open and vulnerable. "Master Chief," he began, his voice quiet and steady. "I know I've apologized. I wrote the letters. But I came here tonight because I realized that saying sorry wasn't enough. I came to ask if you would be willing to teach me." Samuel stopped his sweeping and leaned on his broom, giving the young man his full, patient attention. Cade continued, his words coming in a rush. "The general had me read the official histories. But they're just words on a page. They don't explain how you could do what you did, how you could stay calm, how you could have hands that could do what yours did, how you could find it in yourself to speak up for me after what I did." The questions hung in the silent air. They were not the questions of an officer seeking tactical knowledge, but of a man seeking wisdom. Samuel looked at the young, humbled face before him and saw not the arrogant officer who had insulted him, but a student, ready to learn. He gestured with his head toward a nearby bench. "Sit down, son." Cade sat, and Samuel sat beside him, his old broom resting at his side. And in the quiet, empty temple of war, surrounded by the ghosts of spent cartridges and the lingering scent of gunpowder, the old hero began to speak. He didn't speak of battles or medals. He spoke of the man from Ohio who was the M60 gunner. He spoke of his sense of humor, of the letters he wrote home to his mother. He spoke of the sacred trust between men in the face of death. He began to teach, and Cade began, for the first time, to truly listen. The cycle of arrogance had been broken, replaced by a quiet, vital link in the long, unbroken chain of mentorship, passing wisdom from one generation of warrior to the next.